Ah, Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, HOD, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PhD coursework, good afternoon. Today I am going to deliver my lecture on medieval literature in English. So this topic is it is extensive topic, and it may be discussed in several lectures. So this is a very widespread topic. Medieval literature in English is the today's topic. Although there is no official consensus regarding the exact beginning and end of the medieval period, it is most commonly associated with the collapse of the Roman Empire around the 5th century AD and leading up all the way to the 15th century, which is widely considered, though the exact beginning is disrupted, the beginning of the Renaissance period. This time period is commonly known as the Middle Ages, was commonly regarded by the Renaissance thinkers as the Dark Ages. On the continent, the development of medieval literature, stemming from the preservation of culture and heroic adventures within epic poems, is a direct result of Charlemagne's desire to educate the people in 1800, which was only made possible through an emphasis on the teachings of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church created schools with an intensive curriculum founded upon the education of grammar, rhetoric, Latin, astronomy, philosophy, and math. Christianity was legalized by the Roman Empire during the 4th century, and as a result, education as well as laws was overseen by the church. The church often wielded more power than the often weak feudal monarchies medieval that characterized medieval society. In the 12th century, there arose a strong presence of chivalry in medieval society, which quickly inhabited the literature of the time. The Chivalry Code was a moral code, or rather, a code of conduct bound to duty, honor, and justice, reflected within the texts of the time. The ways in which characters are affected by loyalty, duty, and honor, the chivalry code was both a necessary platform for knighthood and good moral standing. The presence of chivalry in medieval culture is exemplified in the representation of a just and moral knight facing temptation and conflict in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. As a result of the presence of chivalry, courtly love gave rise to an increased production and contemplation of romantic prose. While the printing press was invented in the 15th century, its impact was not fully achieved until the Renaissance. The Middle Ages can be split up into three periods: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the last Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages typically signify the beginning of the medieval era with the fall of Rome and continue until sometimes in the 11th century. Anglo-Saxon tribes invaded England around 450, and they had a vast effect on literature. The language of these invaders is classified as Old English and is widely represented in Anglo-Saxon poetry. Old English poetry was passed down orally before it was written. The earliest written example is found in the writing of Bede and his poem Cidamon's hymn. The Anglo-Saxons helped further spread Christianity by adapting to it, um, however, Anglo-Saxon poetry contains a thematic heroic code, places value on kinship, and emphasizes duty and vengeance for one's Lord Norton. One of the most old English epic poems is Beowulf, which follows suit of its relative Germanic literature with its heroic and Christian themes. The High Middle Ages, there is a noise. Please, please silence your, please keep your microphone in silence mode. Mute it. Epic poems is Beowulf, as I've told. The High Middle Ages are thought to have begun around the Norman invasion. The Norman invasion. Linguistically, this era brought about the transition from Old English to Middle English, feudalism, and the medieval Romance, which came from the French speaking Anglo Normans. Romances characteristically revolve around similar themes of members of the lower nobility trying to rise in status, the young entering adulthood and their fears, and individuals being cast out of society and returning as part of a strong unit. The most popular romantic figure of this time is the character of King Arthur, who arose in the 13th century. The Arthurian romance contains the Chivalry Code involving knights, adventure, and honor. Uh, Lords, Lords and ladies. Other popular romances of this time include Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and William Langland's Piers the Plowman. The late Middle Ages mark the end of the medieval era, which is estimated to have ended around 1485, the year Henry VII ascended to the throne and the Tudor dynasty began. This era contained the Hundred Years of War, which ended in 1453, and the Black Death, which eliminated nearly one-third of Europe's population. In 1485, William Caxton introduced England to the art of printing books when he published Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. According to the history learning site, the church was absolutely the most important part of the medieval society. The church dominated everybody's lives. The only religion that existed was Christianity. All medieval people, regardless of their social rank, believed in God. Heaven and hell, however, it was strongly believed that the only way they could get to heaven is if the Roman Catholic Church allowed them. Similar to today, hell was depicted as every person's worst nightmare, and heaven was eternal paradise. There are many reasons that the church was so dominant during medieval times, but a main reason is its extreme wealthiness. The church made money any way they could, but they made majority of their money through tithes. A tithe, a tithe, T-I-T-H-E. The tithe is a tax that is 1/10 of a person's early earnings. Early earnings or goods that had to be given to the church. Peasants obviously found it very difficult to pay tithes because they have trouble making even enough money for themselves, so they had to pay with seeds or grain. It was not an option. It was not an option to not pay a tithe because it was told that the punishment of not paying a tithe would result in eternal damnation. Other ways the church became so wealthy was their constant charges for receiving sacraments. If one wanted to be baptized, married, or buried, there was a charge, and someone becoming baptized and being buried on holy ground was another way to get to heaven. Marriage was very different in the medieval ages. Married couples were not allowed to live together because it was viewed as a sin. With all this income from basically every person in society, the church was extremely well off, and to keep the church as wealthy as possible, they did not have to pay any taxes. It is said that the church was wealthier than any king in the world during this time period, and they saved most of their money. However, the money that they did spend was on their structures such as churches or cathedrals. The actual structure of the church was the center of all community activities. People who would perform plays, and there were always markets held outside of the church. The church was viewed as having the answers to everything and anything that would happen, especially when something bad happened. If there was a bad storm or an outbreak of disease, the church was supposed to know why. The language of the church, Latin, was the only common language spoken in all of Europe. Anyone who did not know Latin would not be able to communicate. This just proves how important the church truly was. They determined the language of an entire continent. The church held entirely all of the power in the medieval times, and was very well respected. Literary genres in the medieval period, that is from 5th to 15th centuries, most scholars associate the start of the medieval period with the fall of the Roman Empire in 1410 AD. After the Roman withdrew, Germanic tribes invaded and spread their influence on England. Old English period, old poetry, oral poetry. There are not many recorded works from the Old English period, primarily because of the scarcity of people who were literate, mostly limited to clergy members. Oral poetry mainly carried Christian themes, since nothing was written down until there was there was heavy Christian influence. We do not know if these religious undertones were part of the original work, and often centered on the adventures of great heroic figures. It was passed down over generations, which caused it to be continuously changed with each retelling. We may never know many. We may never know how many great works of oral poetry. However, it played a large role in the impacting later written works. Most of Old English poetry is contained in just 4 manuscripts. For example, The Wanderer. Early Middle English period. Germanic heroic poetry, it started out being performed orally in alliterative verse but was later written down by scholars or clergymen. Oftentimes it was used to describe a current events and touched on themes which invoke the ancient code of honor that obliges a warrior to avenge his slain lord or die beside him. They show the aristocratic, heroic, and kinship values of Germanic society that continued to inspire both clergy and laity. The effect of language in Germanic heroic poetry and Old English poetry was to formalize and elevate speech. Anglo-Saxon literature. Elegy. It is typically mournful or sad. It can be in the form of funeral song or a lament for the dead, for example, the wanderer. Middle English literature. Romance, courtly romance. This was the most popular genre in the Middle English period. It had a particular story structure that depicted the integration, disintegration, and reintegration of a central hero. Usually, that the hero underwent a test or challenge that alienated them from society. It is outside the world of everyday experience or unnatural magical. It was the principal narrative genre for late medieval readers and centrally concerned with love, but it developed ways of representing psychological interiority with great subtlety. Though they began in France, their transition into English literature came about from simplified and translated versions of the original French works. Often, romances, whether written for aristocratic audiences or lower class audiences, had to do with a knight attempting to win the love of a woman of much higher class by showing the depth of his character through acts of morality, nobility, and bravery. Allegory, an extended metaphor where something is standing for something else. It is a depiction of a common theme. An allegory tells a story that has characters, setting, and other symbols that serve both a literal and figurative purpose and point out a theme about human life. For example, Pierce the Plowman or Everyman. State, State's satire represents the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. It satirizes society with the purpose of presenting the flaws of something in an exaggerated way, with the intent of drawing attention to create a solution for it. It examines society by groups based on class, occupation, function, status, and other designations. For example, the Canterbury tells. Middle English lyrics, a type of secular poetry. They were generally love poems, although some were about social satire on the celebration of earth and humanity. They were very passionate and not about God. The lyrics do not tell a long story, not an epic odyssey ballad but rather about a single thought or image. They have a very contemporary rhyme scheme and subject matter. Autobiography. Just as autobiographies today tell the story of a person's life through their point of view, early autobiographies did the same thing. They generally depicted the trials and triumphs of a person's life and their internal thoughts about the matter. The first autobiography was the book of Marjorie Kemp, drama, drama in the medieval period, in the medieval ages. For the most part, drama rose to popularity in the later medieval period, ranging from 1000 to 1500. Early dramas were religious in theme, staging, and tradition. Performance of plays outside the church became popular around the 12th century when they became more widely accessible to the general population. Plays were usually performed by a professional acting company that traveled from town to town on wagons and moving stages. Most theatre companies were exclusively male. The second Shepherd's play, morality play, a type of drama that emerged around 1400 and became increasingly popular throughout the century. They taught lessons about morality and human nature and used allegorical characters to portray the struggle that a person goes through to achieve salvation and forces of good and evil. A morality tale could have had either a serious or a comic plot. Religious prose sought to explain the great truths of good. Um, Religious prose sought to explain the great truths of God, humanity, and the universe through an analysis of Christian beliefs, focuses on sin, penance, and love. For example, Marjorie Kemp. Secular literature. There are few examples of secular work during the medieval period as a result of the influence of religion within society. Secular poetry was one of the main works of literature at this time. It was full of satire and irony concerning everyday life. The incline of popularity of these secular works led into the Renaissance. An important example of this type of poetry is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Secular medieval literature helped create a pathway for future authors in the Renaissance. The Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is one of the most well-known secular works from the medieval period. Rather than focus on the church and religion, the Canterbury Tales looks instead at other common ideas of the time, such as courtliness and company. This courtliness or courtly love could be found in many poems and other pieces of literature during this time period. Courtly love is when a woman is treated with utmost respect, care, and love from a knight. He will do anything to make her happy, and her happiness and love in turn makes the knight stronger and more respected. In the Canterbury Tales, courtly love can be found in the Knight's Tale, a story about two knights who fall in love with the same woman and must choose to honor either the code of courtly love or the code of chivalry. The theme of company is also present throughout the entire poem. It is clear in that the pilgrims are traveling together and sharing each other's company by learning about one another and sharing stories. Below, other themes common in medieval secular poetry are spring, love, and politics. Many others satirize the community. Sorry. As the Renaissance began to rise throughout Europe, secularism and humanism became increasingly popular. This time brought on the appreciation of worldly pleasures and above all the intensified assertion of personal independence and individual expression. Instead of focusing on the afterlife, people began focus on their current place in life. They looked towards themselves and who they were as individual people instead of solely people of God. This time in history can be seen as the beginning of the turn to reason and the loss of faith, similar to secular literature of the medieval period. Secular literature of the Renaissance focused on worldly things such as spring and love. The reason part of this literary period inspired essays on human characteristics and politics, with Francis Bacon being one of the most writers of these types of essays. Women in the literature. Throughout the medieval period, women were viewed as second-class citizens, and their needs always were an afterthought. They were either held to be completely deceitful, sexual, innocent, or incompetent. Therefore, women were mostly withheld from positions of power or speaking their voice. Males made decisions for them, and their lives were dictated by the men that ran the society. Despite their lack of validation and suppression, however, women in medieval literature were certainly present in many works and in various forms. Some tropes feed into the idea that women are subservient and inferior to men, such as Virgin, which portrays females as passive and weak, or the another whose very life circles around making a better life for her family and especially for her husband, or even the whore who has no power in her sexuality and must give it way for the well-being of her family or the men in society. However, there are some archetypes that break this cycle, like the trickster or witch, who break the social norms and stand out, displaying qualities of cunning, intelligence, intimidation, and power. The sections below will dive deeper into the disparity between how women were viewed in medieval society and how they were portrayed in the literature of the time. Medieval English literature, the earliest literary period which can meaningfully be called English, can be divided into two major periods, each of which describes the state of development of the English language. Old English, uh, uh, almost 600 to 1100, is the oldest form of the language attested, and it was spoken by a people now known as Anglo-Saxons. As the name suggests, they were a mixed group originally from North Germany and Anglia and Saxony, among other places. Several Several medieval historians, such as the Venerable Bede and Gildas, memorably describe how these Germanic peoples invaded England, displacing the native Roman Britons, now the Welsh, in the mid 5th century under the command of two brothers, Hengist and Horsa. This invasion was often later read as God's punishment upon the Britons for becoming a corrupt Christian people. To be clear, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were pagan peoples when they arrived in England. However, they were missionized by Augustine of Canterbury by papal decree beginning in 597, making them among the earliest Germanic people to convert to Christianity over the course of the 6th century. The story of the rise of the English Church is told by Bede in his ecclesiastical history of the English people. Having come from so many different places, having come from so many different places, it is not surprising that the Anglo-Saxons spoke an array of dialects, although there was no real standard form of Old English toward the end of the period. King Alfred's large-scale bookmaking project ensured that many of our existing texts were copied, sometimes translated even. In the late West Saxon dialect, to modern eyes, Old English does not look much like English at all, and one easily approaches it as a foreign language. It functions somewhat like modern German, with more elaborate noun cases and verb forms than we have now. The Middle English period begins sometime after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Battle of Hastings. The language can safely be called Middle by the year 1300. While difficult to read for modern speakers of English, one can easily make something of a Middle English text without formal linguistic study, though there are subtleties of grammar and vocabulary that repay close linguistic attention. For a quick introduction to the changes involved in the history of the English language, check out this brief yet excellent overview provided. Old English, a preprint literature. Literature of the Old English period is preserved in a number of manuscripts or handwritten books because the printing press was not invented until the 15th century. All texts circulated either orally or in manuscripts. Literacy was a technology cultivated by church, borrowed from pan-Mediterranean cultures such as those of Greece and Rome. Because books were made of animal skin or parchment and were copied individually by hand, they were extremely expensive and rare. Generally, only monasteries, cathedrals, or high-ranking church or noble officials possessed any books. Instead of written text, people relied on their memory and the internalization of texts to a far greater extent that we do today. They had impressively intricate techniques to aid in the task of memorization. Poetry. By definition, Old English poetry is alliterative and accentual. This means that each line on a page in modern editions consists of a pair of half lines and that are linked by alliteration and that follow very specific metrical patterns based on word stress. Also notable is the use of a separate poetic diction, a set of vocabulary used exclusively in poetry, and the principle of variation, metrical patterns, and word combinations should not be repeated often or near each other in a given text. Some experiments in form took place later in the period, and these may have given rise to some alliterative accentual forms we find springing up seemingly out of nowhere later on in Middle English. Germanic heroic legend. Perhaps the most famous work of Old English literature is the long poem Beowulf. It tells Beowulf's life story arranged as a binary of the hero's rising and setting. Like the sun, Beowulf is a princeling of the Geats from southern Sweden who wins their renown by killing monsters. His first major deed is to rid the Danish king Hrothgar's hall, Herod of the man-eating monster Grendel. Grendel. He lies awake at night waiting for Grendel to attack the court under cover of dark. The two wrestle hand to hand as Beowulf refuses to use weapons and he tears Grendel's arm from its socket. The monster escapes, trailing blood, and screams into the darkness of the surrounding fen country. The next evening, as the court celebrates this happy turn of fate, Grendel's mother attacks the court and kills more men. In response, Beowulf and company seek out their lair an underground cave accessible only by swimming through a monster-filled lake. Against all odds, Beowulf hunts her down and kills her. He returns with Grendel's severed head as a trophy, and Hrothgar and his people reward Beowulf handsomely. The second portion of the poem portrays Beowulf in old age, having ruled his people well for 50 years. A dragon awakened by a thief who steals a single cup from its lair ravages Beowulf's land. King Beowulf then confronts the dragon, and the two bring each other to the brink of death. Wiglaf, a brave and loyal companion of Beowulf, helps his lord slay the dragon, and when none other would, and Beowulf's final wish is to see the dragon's treasure before he dies. He then passes, and his people build a great cliff-top fire and burial mound, burning king and treasures together in pagan fashion. The poem is often read as an attempt by a Christian community to reconcile their respect for their pagan ancestors with their newly acquired faith. Elegy, lyrics, and wisdom poetry. Other important types of Anglo-Saxon poetic genres include elegiac lyric or wisdom poetry. Two well-known specimens are The Wanderer and The Seafarer. Each poem can be seen as an outgrowth of the heroic literature mentioned above, for one of the chiefest realities of such a culture was frequent warfare, along with all of the interpersonal loss that brings. Each of these poems is a sort of lyric reflection by a speaker upon the sorrows he or she has experienced in life, including exile and lordlessness. Uh, the poems draw upon nature imagery and a sense of nostalgia shot through with sorrow as the speaker progresses on a journey able to be read both literally and allegorically toward a stoic brand of resignation in the face of such hardships. Religious poetry was extremely important to the Anglo-Saxons, and chief specimens are the Dream of the Rood and the poems in the Junius manuscript. The former is a dream vision in which the dreamer meets the cross of Christ personified, who in turn reflects on the day of crucifixion and its regard at having been involved in the unjust slaying of its own Lord. The latter, the latter works consist of superb poetic translations of Old Testament texts, Genesis A and B, Exodus, Daniel, and Christ and Satan. The, the volume is also notable for its illustrations among the finest of their time. There are many other subtypes of poetry, charms, prayers, psalms, lives of saints, etc. But the the Exeter, the Exeter book riddles are both mentioning. This collection of early hundred riddles are challenging, sometimes humorous reflections upon the ambiguity of meaning and the beauty of language. Since they lack solutions in the manuscript, they have kept amateurs and scholars guessing at their solutions for 2 centuries. Their intricate logic suggests a delight for wordplay among the older readers of English texts. Prose. Initially, after the conversion which brought literacy, Old English was not a language used for prose except for law codes, serious writing such as philosophical or medieval treatises tended to be written in Latin, the international language of learning in the Middle Ages. Yet this changed in England after the Viking invasions of the 9th century left most religious houses too empty and fragmented to produce the scholars with strong Latin skills. After pushing back the Viking threat for a while, King Alfred of Wessex addressed this educational lack with a large scale translation project and book production program. At his behest, a number of important scholarly and religious works were translated into Old English from Latin and were widely reproduced and disseminated across England. This set an early precedent for the use of English as a language of prose learning. The Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history was translated into Old English prose under Alfred, and it remains one of the finest examples of medieval scholarship. Other important prose works included those of the lives of Saints Jonah, miraculous tales intended to encourage beliefs in their faith. After the Norman conquest, many Anglo-Saxon nobles who were dispossessed and a new French-speaking Anglo-Norman technically aristocracy came to power. Of course, these cultural shifts did not occur in all places overnight. However, over time, the Norman nobles cultivated a taste for continental styles of literature such as courtly love, romance, and the matter of Arthur, while older fashions such as Germanic heroic literature fell into disuse. Later in his period, speakers saw the rise of a more standard form of English based primarily upon the dialects of London. Meanwhile, many authors wrote in French because it was the prestige language of the court, such as Marie de France, Lays of Fables, and West Brut. Women writers. A brief note on women writers in the Old English period. Nearly all vernacular texts, prose, or poetry have come to us anonymously, so there is no sure way to access if or how many women were authors. Yet the childhood is low, yet the likelihood is low, given that most writing took place in all male monasteries, and texts do not mention female poets. There are a great number of anonymous lyric poems and ballads found in manuscripts from this entire period. These tend to be short pieces written in rhymed couplets that reflect on such topics as the cycle of nature. Summer is Icumen in religious reflections. Adam lay a burden or a romantic laments. The 14th century is quite pivotal for England as well as for the whole Europe. Between 1347 and 1350, between 1347 and 1450, a plague commonly called the Black Death ravaged the whole of Europe with upwards of 30% of the entire population dying from the disease in that short period of time. The plague killed indiscriminately among rich and poor, secular and clerical, and this left enormous gaps in social institutions. For instance, manual laborers came to be paid much much higher wages after the plague because there was so few to work the fields. This social instability this social instability gave the merchant classes an unprecedented amount of power and social mobility, which in turn encouraged rapid urbanization. Chaucer's Canterbury tells narrates the journey of a group of travelers who are going from London to Canterbury on pilgrimage. Along the way, they have a storytelling contest, and so each of the 29 pilgrims is supposed to tell their own kind of tale. Although the work remained unfinished at the time of Chaucer's death, it has been cherished for centuries because of Chaucer's skill at creating extremely vivid characters who tell highly memorable stories. Sometimes touching, sometimes comic, sometimes disturbing. His most famous characters include the miller, the wife of Bath, the ant, and the pardoner. Courtly love. Courtly love was a literary trend that flourished especially among the French nobility. This genre exalted an idealized code of chivalry in which a knight vows undying loyalty to his lady, who may bestow a favor upon him, but who never in theory takes him as a lover, though this last aspect was often subverted in literature as well as in life. Chaucer wrote one of the finest examples of the genre in his long narrative poem Troilus and Cressida, which adapts the story of the fall of Troy to a courtly romance sensibility. Among Chaucer's shorter works are the Parliament of Fowls, in which he may have invented Valentine's Day, the Book of the Duchess, and many others. In the century after his death, Chaucer's admirers and poetic imitators were many, for he was quite popular in his day. They include John Lydgate, Thomas Hoccleve, and John Skelton. Such authors helped solidify Chaucer's position as father of English poetry, which is, of course, a contestable title given how much poetry came from Geoffrey. This is not to say that he was not utterly influential or later English literature, merely that he was not first. Religious upheaval. The social upheaval of the era was no stranger to religion. Up to this point, the Catholic Church, centered upon the Vatican in Rome, had been the dominant leading voice for the Western Christian faith. However, voices of dissent began to crop up during this period, many of which rallied around an Oxford scholar and theologian named John Wycliffe, who promoted the translation of the scriptures into plain English. His hope was that people could inform themselves on matters of belief rather than having to rely upon priests to translate and interpret Latin scripture for them. Meanwhile, although poets like Chaucer and Langland were concerned with national and global matters, some poets looked back with nostalgia upon the past and turned to regional identity as a source of solace amidst all the chaos of the era. The Pearl poet, so called because his works are anonymous, left us with two poems considered the crowning achievements of the alliterative revival. Gawain and the Great Knight tells an Arthurian tale but alters it by telling it in a deliberately archaic form, highly reminiscent of Anglo-Saxon poetry. It uses the same style of obscure vocabulary and scheme of alliteration, though with an innovative stanzic form. Each stanza ends with a Bob and Bill rhymed couplet. This fusion of old and new is taken even further in Pearl, an intricately wrought and deeply moving dream vision that chronicles a father's struggle to cope with the loss of his great pearl, now buried in his garden. This is often read as an allegory for the loss of daughter and named Marguerite. The daughter appears to him in her heavenly glorified body and walks him through his theological questionings and doubts about his faith. This era, this age also saw a resurgence in the popularity of drama. Early on, this form consisted of two major types: morality plays and mystery plays. The former aimed to impart moral, ethical, and spiritual truth by means of dramatizing an allegorical life. Famous examples include plays Every Man and Mankind. The latter include the York cycle of plays held early for the summer feast of Corpus Christi in the northern city of York. This cycle consisted of a series of plays, each sponsored by a local guild and each presented on its own pageant wagons. The plays dramatize the whole story of the Bible from creation to the second coming of Christ, and it could take as long as 12 hours of continual performance at one station at a time for the whole cycle of unfold across the city. There were also traveling shows such as the end town plays. So this way, the first part of this lecture is finished, my dear students. It is not completed. It would be completed next day. Maybe it may be tomorrow. So this way, I have finished my lecture, and I